The road home's exploration of nationalism could not be complete without some discussion of Donald Trump. His rise in American politics accompanied a rise in nationalism, especially within the Republican Party. Peter J. Hasson, former editor of the Daily Caller and current journalist at Fox News, joined us to offer his perspective on American nationalism and immigration policy. This conversation with Peter J. Hasson is from spring 2020. So, Peter, thanks for joining us. Happy to have you part of this project. And I thought a good place we could start would be with some subject that's related to your book that came out recently, The Manipulators. What I think your book is part of is a growing recognition that some of the institutions, whether they're business or media or technology, or in some cases even government, have more of an ideological bias than sometimes people are willing to recognize. And I think the way that's relevant to this conversation about nationalism is that it means that the way nationalist ideas are interpreted by some of these institutions are, I would say, in a less than favorable light at times. So I was wondering if you could comment on just that idea in your book about the influence of ideology in tech companies in particular, and whether you think that has an impact on our conversations about nationalism.
Absolutely. So there's a saying in politics that personnel is policy, and so what happens at a lot of, or what has happened at a lot of our institutions, like the big tech companies, but also government, education, and so on. So what happens is if you have a kind of a monoculture of thought, then the output is going to look, pretty much like what the input is. And so if you have people who all, if you have, let's say, everybody Google kind of sees, or Facebook or Twitter, or any company, I'm just choosing them as an example. If you have the dominant idea, there is that nationalism is kind of viewed as this kind of scary, intrinsically bad thing, then the end result is that when Facebook or Twitter or so on, when they make rules, and they're trying to distinguish between what's inbounds and what's out of bounds. It's a lot easier for kind of just ideas to get misunderstood or misrepresented. And so that's definitely why a project like what you that's definitely why a project like what you're doing is so important to kind of just educate people on the positive attributes of nationalism, and to kind of really distinguish the good from the bad. Because the last thing anybody should want is is having people who are kind of on the fringe deciding that they're nationalist, and then having everybody tell them that nationalism means Nazism or something, and they say, okay, well, I'm a Nazi, So I think it's important to really give people a positive alternative to it, and kind of see all the positive attributes of it.
Yeah, and do you think there is a prevailing opinion about nationalism in these tech companies? Like, I don't know. I know you've researched many different aspects of the way this technology interacts with conservative ideology, but I'm curious if you think, is there a view on nationalism? And I suppose given that these are global companies, there probably is some bias toward globalization and internationalism in these organizations. But did you learn anything about how they might think about nationalism and how that might influence the way their services operate and affect us?
Yeah, so there's I mean, kind of, prevailing belief there, um, about nationalism is it's kind of just viewed as a foreign, scary idea that's probably viewed as a synonym for authoritarianism. Um, one of those things that gets misrepresented. And so, when you have people making, the boundaries online, and they're saying, okay, well, you can't express support for, you know, Nazi ideas or something. Well, if positive nationalism is just viewed through the lens of all nationalism um, is bad, then the end result is going to be a lot of things that should be in bounds are really out of bounds. And so I think it definitely hurts when you have people whose ideas really have so much impact, really kind of just uh, um, seeing it as in kind of a straw man form as this uh, jingoistic, uh, uh, scary thing. And that's, again, that just kind of comes back to the first point, which is personnel as policy. And so if you don't have anybody in an institution with even a passing understanding of nationalism and what it is and it is not, um, then I mean the way that gets incorporated into their work is it's not going to be accurate. And so it's really important for everybody to kind of at least have a common baseline.
Yeah, that makes sense, and I think that that's a of course every organization has to deal with its own biases and all of
Right.
that. But what you outline well in the book, I think, is the unique power that some of the tech companies have, and so their biases become really important for them to be aware of, and really important for people outside of those companies to be mindful of in terms of how they might affect our lives and what we're exposed to on our phones or on our computers.
Mhm.
um, so you mentioned a couple of times positive nationalism, and of course, that I enter the conversation with the assumption that there are some good things that nationalism can
Yeah.
do for people. I'm wondering what you think they are. What's your when you say positive nationalism, what do you think of?
So yeah, and when I say positive, uh, positive uh, nationalism, I really means civic nationalism. And so really kind of as opposed to ethnic nationalism or something along that lines, but really kind of you know uh, uh, you know ideas, but also really kind of it's an easy way to build unity across racial lines, gender lines, even political lines. Really, if you really start to kind of see yourself and your neighbors and the guy across the street as all part of the same project, and so really all part of the same team. When I think of positive nationalism, I honestly think of Texas. Um, uh, people in Texas love Texas. They're they'll about how their restaurants are great, or the sunsets and the Texas culture. But of course, that doesn't mean they hate people in Oklahoma. They just love Texas, and so they want Texas to do well. They see each other as fellow Texans, um, and they're interested in kind of keeping Texas great. And so that's kind of almost an analogy of sorts, in that I think if everybody in America felt about America the way people in Texas feel about Texas, I think it'd be a much more positive place, a much more uh, I don't know, much more y- unifying place. I mean, Texas on the whole is, it's I think more purple than are aware, but you don't really see as much of the street violence, or like it's in Portland, or you don't see Charlottesville type things happening. And I think a lot of that has to do with kind of the Texas spirit of people all feeling like we're all part of this great thing that's called Texas. Um, so that's kind of just I guess come back to the question. I mean, that's kind of how I view a positive nationalism. Um, as opposed to kind of the darker forms we've seen at different times in history and whatnot, that people love to kind of cite as like the definition of nationalism.
Yeah, and those darker forms, given that you, I think, are very aware of the online conservative community and the online conservative conversation, I feel like every time, someone talks about some of the positive forms of nationalism online, there's always, whether it's, through social media platforms or it's through comment sections or, whatever it might be, some of those dark forms make themselves known. And I think that's a challenge that I see a lot of conservatives having to figure out is how do we advance conservative ideology in a way that also challenges some of our internal issues concerning race and culture and tolerance and inclusivity and things like that. So I'm wondering if you seen like who does that well? Are there things that you look at and say, oh, this is the kind of conservatism that might actually challenge itself to not stand alongside those dark forms of nationalism, but actually challenge them and distinguish itself from them?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely been kind of the challenge, is always trying to kind of um, uh, really kind of on the one hand keep the darker aspects at bay, but on the other hand making sure that they aren't given a monopoly on things like loving country, and loving wanting to protect wages and whatnot. Because if the extremists are the only ones talking about those things, uh, then people who care about the who care about that kind of thing is attracted to the uh, extremists. And so I think one person who's done a good job of really kind of um, of kind of bridging that gap, and being clear about what's um, about kind of the positive aspects of nationalism. An easy example would be Sagar Enjeti at The Hill. Yeah, I think he does a really strong job of kind of getting to the heart of the issue, in terms of caring about working class, and caring about national identity. Um, um, if but obviously that there are people out there who are um, extremists, who do want to kind of co-opt the entire conversation. And I think one conservatives can do, and really should be doing, is to really kind of I guess to really just welcome people of all of all races and ethnicities, and so on, to really kind of be leaders in the conservative movement. And that's really like an easy way to kind of flush out the races. If you have, let's say, let's say Tim Scott is the nominee in 2024 or something like that. It really sends kind of a clear message kind of the extremist elements that here's who we are, and if you have a problem with that, then this is not for you. And you can do all that without watering down your beliefs and what you think is true. And really, I think that's an area where conservatives across the board can really do need to improve, is kind of just um, you know uh, you know using and acknowledging everybody on the team, so to speak, um, um, to really kind of be clear about who you are, and what your values are, and what you stand for. Um, um, but so that's but it's definitely a tricky topic that I do think people on the right need to kind of about combating.
Absolutely. And that one of the areas that it often comes up in is on the immigration conversation,
Mhm.
right? Because, I've seen numerous times that a conservative host of a TV show or a radio show or a conservative conference, they will say, okay, well, we believe that some kind of regulation and control over our borders is important. We believe that immigration policy should be subordinated to the needs of our population so that we make sure the people who are in our country have what they need to be successful. And all of that sounds very reasonable. And then you find out that, like a Trojan horse,
Yeah.
some kind of racist kind of sneaks in on those grounds where they say, yeah, I just want to control immigration. And then, then you find out it's actually because they're a white nationalist,
Yeah.
right?
Hmm.
And I think that that's the issue that I most see conservatives, especially in the United States, having a hard time really articulating a view of immigration that is both clear to their principles, but also excludes people who want to bring race or ethnicity or ancestry, DNA, biology, whatever it may be, into the immigration debate. Do you also see that same tension around the immigration issue? And do you think it's like, is it going to get better anytime soon? I mean, as a Canadian, I watch, I pay a lot of attention to American politics, and I find that that's the issue that feels most troubling to me, is
Hmm.
that I don't think the American right has figured out how to talk about immigration without opening itself up to sometimes legitimate criticism from the left that it's race baiting or dog whistling or whatever the case.
Yeah, and I think that's something where I think one of the big failures of the right has been really not articulating why. Um, you know, you're, yeah, I guess just the articulating the why. For um, uh, i- uh, immigration in particular. And that's and it's a key piece of the puzzle, because it's not that we don't want, it's not that um, you shouldn't be arguing we don't want these people coming in because they're from Guatemala, and we or on account of race or ethnicity. But I mean, really, what's at the core of it is it's a um, wage issue. And so the tighter the labor market is, the higher wages go. And I think that's something that really kind of got um, really got left out of the conversation for a while. And I think part of that is because the right was, on the one hand, pro business, but on the other hand, the only uh, party really kind of you know opposing opening the floodgates. I think there's kind of this cognitive dissonance, or there was for a while, in that you had kind of the pro business side that doesn't really care about wages as much as it cares about profit margins. And so I think it kind of got away from wages and kind of more towards kind of identity and things like that. Um, I I do think that I guess kind of where the immigration issue goes in terms of that kind of volatility, um, I think going to be is going to be immensely dependent on kind of who wins in 2020. Uh, uh, because I think I think what is likely to happen is if you have kind of a Democrat come in and really kind of loosen all the rules, and you have some candidates talking about suspending deportations for like 3 months, and then and kind of um, uh, just doing things that incentivize kind of the human traffickers, really kind of stuff that's bad from a humanitarian perspective. But I do think what happens is what's going to happen if you have somebody come in and kind of radically, change the rules, to being way more open, is that you're going to see a backlash then. And I think with uh, the backlash, I think that's kind of where you might worry about it getting more volatile. Whereas, yeah, I think if Trump is in office, um, I think on the whole, he kind of has a bit more latitude to kind of, um, um, uh, to really, I think if he wanted to do something like, amnesty for DACA or something, I think he'd have a lot more. He'd be able to get away with a lot more than somebody on the left would be. Um, um, but yes, I think that's. I mean, it's definitely a real concern, and it's kind of one of those. I guess we'll have to wait and see. But it is something that could be kind of a turning point for the worst, depending on how the um, uh, elections go. And then to just kind of pick up on one other thing I briefly touched on, which is I do think people on the right need to do a better job of kind of um, articulating kind of the um, humanitarian side of kind of controlling the border. I think Brandon Darby at Breitbart. Now, I'm not I don't really I'm not a big Breitbart guy, but he's kind of the exception to the rule. And it helps that he has kind of his own operation. It's not really in coordination with the national. But anyway, he does just a really good job of kind of exposing the toll that that are placed on these poor people from third world countries, um, by kind of having them go through like the cartel route and the trafficking route. It's really honestly just some pretty horrific things that happen to people who I'm sure have the best of intentions. Um, and so I do think that that's something where the right needs to be talking about it more. Is kind of this isn't just about you know it's, this is it's not just about saying screw those people trying to cross the border. It's about that's actually not good for them either. If they're kind of becoming the slaves to the cartels for a month while they travel across. Um, and so I do think that there's kind of a lot of that nuance that needs to be there, and that I think oftentimes gets left out of the conversations on the right because people kind of frame their own thinking in terms of not the left. And so if you well, the left cares about immigrants, well, I don't. And it's kind of uh, it's kind of a lazy way of thinking. because you basically get to let your opponent choose all of your ideas for you. But yeah, I mean, that's definitely could be an area where the right needs to kind of find a balance between kind of addressing an important issue and one that impacts the people of the country, but also um, not allowing it to kind of veer into the dangerous territory. Uh, but then also, on you know, the, the other hand, if you um, allow the extremists to be the only ones talking about and kind of the only ones being kind of a dissenting voice on mass um, immigration, then the people who have concerns about that, the only people who are speaking for them are the extremists, and then you get people pulled into the kind of extremist side. And so I do think it's important to kind of have an honest conversation about it, so that the bad faith actors can't really take advantage of that gap.
Yeah, that yeah, I see that, and certainly I recognize the dangers of not having open dialogue about important issues, which I think is the biggest issue problem with political correctness and that sort of social censorship is that we wind up not being able to discuss things and we drive some of these conversations to the fringes, right? Which it doesn't help
Exactly.
anybody. Um, in closing, I wanted to just take you back to a comment you made about Texas because I could see how much you love your, your current state when
Yeah.
you were talking about it. And in some ways, I think Texas is sort of a mix of the issues that may define America moving forward, right? I mean, it is, as you said, an increasingly purple state with Democrats and Republicans. It's a very diverse state with a growing Latino population. It's got a large Black population as well. It's got some very formidable cities, but it's also got its more rural parts. Um, and I think the way I tend to look at Texas is that a Republican Party that keeps Texas over the coming decades is probably a Republican Party that's going to need to have a much better understanding of and respect for Latino communities.
Hmm.
And that, as more people flee sort of California and some other states to come into Texas, it's the Latino population is going to be increasingly important to balance out what I think will be left leaning votes from those new Texas residents, and keep the state red. And so obviously I think immigration then becomes an important part of that conversation. As someone who's in Texas, give me your thoughts on what the future of Texas holds and whether you think that provides some sort of roadmap for what the future of conservative politics in the country at large looks like.
Uh, yeah. So kind of going forward, I think people on the right, especially in Texas, are really going to have to kind of you know recognize that common ground that they have with the Latino community, especially, but also the uh, African American community, because both of which are more culturally center right than the white progressives coming in from California. And so that's definitely something where Texas is kind of a microcosm for kind of the broader issue, in that people on the right are going to need to find common ground around culture, to really have a political future, um, because that's where they kind of there's so much more kind of agreement on cultural issues among working class white people, working class Black people, but it seems the divide then gets to be about race, and then once and then people kind of sprint off to their respective parties. Um, but there really is just so much in common there that people need to kind of um, uh, really need to kind of embrace. And and then to go back to immigration, yeah, that's definitely something where um, you know Republicans are really going to have to do a good job of kind of articulating the difference between being legal immigration and anti, uh, uh, anti, uh, 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 you know, open borders and whatnot, because there are a lot of people, in Texas who have a grandparent or a cousin or an aunt or an uncle who came over from Mexico, and it's very much kind of a uh, immigration culture, and it's awesome because I mean it really adds something special to the Texas culture. Um, but that's kind of where again you kind of have to be really specific about what you are saying and what you aren't saying, and make very clear that it's not about race, that you do care about people's families, and you care about their uncle and their aunt. Um, and so that's something where, yeah, again, you're going to have to come back to that. Um, uh, you're going to have to find kind of a compromise there if um, you know, especially unless they want the white progressives who come in from California to be deciding what's uh, how the state is going. They're going to need to really work and make honest outreach to kind of these communities that they haven't made great inroads with.